If Eboshi was the mother of the baby, or if Princess Mononoke was the baby of Eboshi Gozen, a lot of things would make sense. The reason is, since she killed the leader of the Woku, if that person had a child, she probably wouldn't have much affection for them. And even if you think, no, that's not true, she's a woman, so she should have affection for the child she gave birth to, that's not the case. There are no children in Eboshi's Tatara settlement. The strict birth control I mentioned earlier is also something Lady Eboshi herself enforces. If she had, say, abandoned her own child or made it clear to everyone that she had lost her child, then it would make sense that everyone in the village accepts that children have to endure things. It would be consistent within herself too. If you think about the relationship between Eboshi and Sun as a parent and child, and between Eboshi and the mountain people, it also makes sense why Moro and Eboshi would hate each other so intensely. Because you see, at the beginning of this movie, Moro is injured after being shot by Eboshi, but up until she was shot, there shouldn't have been such a strong grudge. So why do they hold such a personal grudge against each other, calling each other out by name? Moro even says she won't stop until she bites Eboshi to death. It's a personal vendetta. Why is it such a personal grudge? If you think about it, the fact that the child she abandoned was raised by Moro as a sickly child becomes a symbol of her own sense of guilt. Every time she sees it, her guilt stirs within her. No matter how much she tries to convince herself that the child is gone, that feeling remains. And thinking about it that way, I've always wondered who gave Princess Mononoke the facial tattoos. It was a real mystery to me. One possible interpretation is, when San grew up, she might have thought, I'm no longer human, I'll never cry again, and carved the tattoos herself. But I also wonder if, when she was abandoned, the tattoos were carved into her as a way of saying, this child is no longer human. Maybe she was marked and cast away. That's something I can't help but think about. Anyway, around here you can really sense the emotional fluctuations between Moro and Eboshi. If you focus on San and the world of the Mononoke, a lot of things start to make sense. Also fairly early on, there's a scene on the roof where Lady Eboshi is having a rather pleasant conversation with Ashitaka. She tries to persuade him to stay at Tatara and work there, saying, Ashitaka, why don't you stay here and give us your strength? She says, if you stay here and give us your strength, once the old gods are gone and light returns to the forest, this will become a good land. Even Princess Mononoke will return to being human. In other words, Lady Eboshi believes that the reason San, Princess Mononoke, hates her is because Moro, the wolf goddess, taught her to hate. So she thinks that if she kills Moro and the other wolves, San will return to the human world. That's why in the scene right after this, when San attacks Eboshi, Eboshi actually isn't fighting her seriously. She has people stationed all around to make sure San can't escape. Even though Eboshi is clearly superior to San in terms of physical skills and martial arts, she makes no attempt to finish her off. Instead, it's almost as if a cat is toying with a mouse. The reason is she's waiting for San to exhaust her strength and collapse. That's how she's trying to capture her. She doesn't show any such expression, nor does she reveal that kind of face. Instead, she gives off an air as if she's about to kill. But despite being much stronger, she doesn't actually do anything to her opponent. And Moro also hates Eboshi. But even so, Moro herself, the wolf goddess, wants San to return to the human world. This is the farewell scene at Mount Moro. It's the part where she says, I will be your eyes, as San leaves. Here, for the first time, San clings tightly to Moro and acts affectionately. Then Moro's eyes open, her long eyelashes appear, and you see her eyes. It's a scene that really makes you realize what a sensual wolf she is. And then, as the self-defense and Eboshi's god-killing begin in earnest, San says her final farewell to her mother so she can follow the Kodama. Both of them know they will never see each other again, and at that moment, Moro says, you also have the option of going with that young man. Well, her voice is a bit deeper though. Earlier when Ashitaka said, you can live together with San, that girl is human, Moro just laughed mockingly. It was like this. She says things like, Hamuki, how could you possibly live together? That kind of mocking laughter. But you see, Moro is someone who never really says what she truly feels. Throughout the entire anime, she almost never speaks her mind. Even when she reunites with Okoto, the boar god who was once her lover, she says, so someone with a bit of sense has come, but then adds, have you lost even the ability to speak? She only says things like that, but she absolutely never reveals her true feelings. When Akihiro Miwa voiced Moro, there's a story in this video about how she couldn't pick up on the emotional nuances that Moro has. She didn't notice at all and just performed the lines as usual. When she said, "So someone with a bit of sense has come," Hayao Miyazaki got really restless, jumped out from behind the control booth and went over to talk to her. He said something like, "Yeah," and then went on, "You know, Moro used to have a good relationship with Okotonushi in the past." When he said that, Miwa responded with, "Huh?" He said, "Yes, the wolf and the boar used to have a good relationship." When he said something like that, Akihiro Miwa said, "I want it to be much deeper." "I see," I thought. Then when he slightly changed his tone of voice, he said, "It's like a man and woman who used to be lovers, but now they can't even understand each other's words anymore. There's a faint sense of pity there, I suppose." Is this pity directed at oneself? It's a kind of pity toward the self that once loved. When someone who understands you a little finally shows up, it's like when a high school girl sees her boyfriend coming over and says to her friends, "Oh, that idiot's here again." There's just a hint of that nuance. But then I think, well, why don't you just write that into the script? But Miyazaki and the others don't write it in. That thing about them originally being lovers. You know, if Hayao Miyazaki hadn't told Akihiro Miwa about that on location in Africa and then by chance on Nippon TV, most of the time, if it hadn't been filmed, we would never have known about it. He does this kind of thing all the time. Why does this old man do things like that? The essence of Hayao Miyazaki's unique tricks, his methods, and the way he handles characters, I'll talk about that, including the reasons why he does these things in the latter half. As for Moro, she actually thinks it's fine for San to be involved in the human world, even as she mocks, saying, "So, how are you going to live?" Still, for that to happen, she thinks Eboshi has to be killed. That's how it was before. San can't be returned to the world where Eboshi exists. The reason is that Lady Eboshi is a destroyer of the forest. Among humans, she is an especially malicious presence. Both Moro and Eboshi are adult women, and both are thinking about saving San. Eboshi, for her part, kills the boars and then kills the forest spirit, letting light into the forest. In other words, the forest becomes civilized and turns into a part of human society. If the forest simply becomes an asset, like a natural resource, then Lady Eboshi thinks that Princess Mononoke can return to the human world. So if you think of this movie as being about two mothers, each trying to save one girl, their daughter, and both pulling her in different directions, it becomes much easier to understand, right? Eboshi actually throws exactly the same line at Ashitaka. Moro says these words to Ashitaka, "How do you plan to live? Will you fight alongside San against the humans?" She mocks him like that. And then Eboshi delivers almost the exact same line when she hears that Tatara is under attack. Look at this. The direction is just reversed left to right, but she mocks him in exactly the same way. She presses Ashitaka saying, "Stop killing the forest spirit and go kill the samurai instead." The relationship between these two lines is no coincidence. There's no way something like this would happen by accident in a carefully crafted film. The directions are reversed, but they're saying the same thing. How do you want me to live? Or how do you want that child to live? Should I stop killing gods and start killing samurai, or are you going to fight against humans? They're questioning him, completely mirroring each other. On both sides, the roles are reversed, but they're asking the same question with the same composition. They're questioning Ashitaka, the protagonist. In other words, two mothers are asking the man who could become their daughter's husband about how their daughter should live. It's a rhetorical question. Is that really what you want? Even though they know Ashitaka's answer isn't that, they're asking as strict mothers, how much do you really care about my daughter? With a mocking laugh, they use the same lines. It's a curse, isn't it? The two of them are, after all, in the same position. That's because they're both mothers and at the same time leaders of their respective tribes. Thinking along these lines, I started to wonder if Eboshi might actually be San's real mother. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's no evidence for this anywhere, but if you look at it this way, there are no contradictions. And then there's the very important relationship between Okotonushi and Moro, who are supposed to be very important. Actually, they were lovers. I came to this idea based on Miyazaki Hayao's creative process, where he originally intended to leave some things unsaid. However, both Moro and Eboshi, if Eboshi is indeed San's mother, are trying to keep San from realizing the truth. That's why both mothers are putting on an act, fighting each other because they believe that unless they kill the other, their own daughter's future is doomed. All right, let's take a look at the Tatara from the outside. Can we zoom in here? This part, yes, thank you. This is the entrance to the Tatara. There's a bridge right in front, and for this section, we've made it movable. As you can see, it's designed so that these huge stakes can open up, allowing people to enter. This entrance is only accessible via this one wide bridge. And every day before sunset, 4 men work together to handle this massive. They turn a mechanism to close the bridge and shut the gate. Of course, this is to keep out enemies and outsiders. The gate opens outward. If it opened inward, it would be vulnerable to battering rams, those big log-like weapons used in castle sieges. If you hit it repeatedly, it could be forced open, so it's designed as a sliding door that can't be pushed open from the outside. In that sense, it's built like a mountain fortress, truly meant for defense. Now you might think, well, why not just attack it with a battering ram? But if you consider the structure of a Tatara, or rather, its very definition, you can't attack it with fire. Why is that? First, there's a huge iron smelting furnace in the center, and the place is equipped with fire prevention systems. The reason people attack a Tatara is because they want what's inside. They want the facilities and the iron sand, so that's why they attack. In reality, the only way to take it is to send in troops and force a surrender. There's no other way. You have to capture the people and the equipment inside. If you kill the people or destroy the equipment, then it's pointless. The people who want a Tatara don't want to destroy it, they want to possess it. That's why you can't attack it with fire. Because of this structure, it's actually an excellent fortress. Now let's take a look at how the Tatara is used in scenes from the anime. As I mentioned earlier, the gate is the type that opens and closes, swinging outward. And when you go inside, you'll notice there's actually a lot of smoke rising from cooking rice and such. That's just everyday life. That's the scenery. Now, about the lower level, which is called the kuruma. In this model, there are 2 levels, the lower and upper kuruma. The lower kuruma serves as the living space for the cattle herders and ox drivers. The upper level is where the people who work at the Tatara live. Coming back to this, if you look at the building in the back, you'll see there's a banquet hall on the 2nd floor where everyone is eating and drinking together. So, there are actually a lot of 2-story buildings like this at the Tatara, especially in the lower Kuruma area. While it looks like men and women are having fun together, in reality, meals are eaten separately by gender. If you look at the 3rd figure, you'll see only men eating together, having catered meals. This man here is putting what looks like simmered daikon into his own bowl, and this is how everyone eats their meals. It's kind of like the way school lunches are served. Both men and women from the gate or the entrance, beyond that it's just woods. But the men don't try to go into the area where the women are. They only come as far as the gate. And the women, when they see the dashitaka there, gather at the entrance and stand around, but they never come inside. It's a rather mysterious, almost school-like scene, and that's how the Tataraba is set up. Let's go back to the model for a moment. In the lower Kuruma area, there are shops and restaurants and so on. Since it's a place for exchanging sweets, or rather it's more like a rationing system for things like rice, there are such arrangements. If you go further in, there's a single road. This long straight road is an uphill path that connects to the upper Kuruma via a narrow road. Normally the gate between the upper and lower Kuruma is open, so men and women are free to interact here. However, in the event of an emergency or some kind of battle, this gate is closed and the upper Kuruma becomes completely independent. The Roman aqueduct also stores water in the huge reservoir of the upper Kuruma. The idea is that if war breaks out and the area is invaded, they abandon the lower Kuruma, they let the enemy occupy the lower Kuruma, and then force the enemy troops to concentrate on this single road leading to the upper Kuruma. Since there's only one road, it actually makes it easier to concentrate the enemy forces. This makes it much easier to defend. This is exactly the same concept as the Sanada Maru. In fact, in the latter half of the movie, when the local samurai Asanokubo attacked, they quickly abandoned the lower Kuruma and switched to a siege defense holding out only in the upper Kuruma. That's how it was done. Well, that's how the siege unfolded. First, they were attacked by the Asano faction, and quite quickly, the lower edge was occupied, and the enemy entered the lower enclosure. Then, the Asano faction started carrying out the rice and other goods they had seized through the gate. The gate was left wide open. At an early stage, the lower area was already occupied. However, this was something that Eboshi Gozen had anticipated in advance. When it came to the siege, it's a bit hard to visualize, but this is a slope. Here, there's a single road running along the upper Kurohaniku slope, and along it, they lined up a row of upward-pointing sharp stakes called sakamogi to prevent the enemy from advancing. By allowing the lower enclosure to be occupied, they forced the enemy to use only this single route. This made it easier to defend, even for women. The structure is exactly the same as Sawadamaru at Osaka Castle. Well, as you can tell from the story so far, the men, the cattle herders, live down below in the lower enclosure. The craftsmen too, when it comes time to actually live, seem to go down to the lower enclosure. As for the upper enclosure, where the Tatara ironworks are located, there are places around here where men work with iron, but it seems that's only because they're allowed to come and go freely. Basically, the upper enclosure is a world inhabited only by women. So what Eboshi Gosen is trying to protect is only the women. This is something I truly came to feel deeply while creating this. For example, when the cattle drivers like Beniroku and the others were attacked by Moro and fell into danger, Eboshi Gosen abandoned them without hesitation and hurried back. To her, men are expendable and the ones who must be protected are the women. That's why the structure is like this. And although the people at the ironworks never say this out loud, you can sense that somehow they all understand. So even when she abandons Koroku and the others, the people around her rather readily go along with it. In the story, the abandoned Koroku and the leader-like woman named Oji, who is at the Tatara mill, are actually husband and wife. However, there are absolutely no scenes showing them living together. In this anime, there are actually a lot of detailed depictions of daily life at the Tatara mill, almost to the point of being excessive. But when it comes to married life or family life, that sense of everyday living is completely absent. Truly, it's just not there at all. It's depicted almost like a school or an animation studio. That's the way it's portrayed. Now, this is just my own speculation, but probably in Princess Mononoke, for various reasons, there are absolutely no children shown. But if children were to be born, I think this is what would happen. If a girl is born, she would be managed in the upper quarters, and the girls born there would become candidates for executive positions. As the first generation of executive candidates at the Tatara mill, they would be raised to become future leaders. And if a boy is born, he would be raised in the lower quarters. They're basically treated like temp workers who aren't given any important jobs. If a girl is born, she's a candidate for a full-time executive position. If a boy is born, he's treated like a temp or part-timer and is told to go work in the lower quarters. This is exactly the same as what was depicted in High Harbor in Future Boy Conan. Hayao Miyazaki had already portrayed this kind of world in the TV series Future Boy Conan, where when a boy is born in High Harbor, he's sent to a place called the Wilderness, deep in the village. The boys are sent to raise livestock and support a poor lifestyle, while for some reason when girls are born, they get to stay in the village of High Harbor, harvesting wheat and generally living a much easier life. That's how it's depicted, and the structure is exactly the same here, with an even more isolated facility further back from the upper quarters. In reality, this facility is located on a lower level, down a step from the main area, but it's still part of the upper quarters. To prevent bringing in impurities or curses, there's a pond here and a waterway runs all the way around, with the isolation facility located across this waterway. And further inside, is it for Hansen's disease patients? There's a research facility for people with Hansen's disease. That's how it's reported. Inside, it's set up as a medicinal herb garden, and here they're developing a secret weapon, a new type of Ishibia. When you watch the Eboshi Gozen and her people handling it, as I mentioned earlier, unlike the matchlock type where you have to load gunpowder and bullets each time, this new type of Ishibiya they're making here uses a cartridge system where you just swap out a magazine that already contains both the gunpowder and bullets. The engineers developing this, who are Hansen's disease patients, speak a bit strangely. In the movie, you can hear them saying things like scary, scary. They're different from both Eboshi and the people of Tataraba. Their speech is actually a bit like Kyoto dialect. The way they say scary scary has a Kyoto, or rather a noble accent from Kyoto prefecture. So I think they were probably engineers from the imperial court or the emperor's side. These people likely had experience studying abroad, maybe in private homes or in Korea, where they learned various technologies, but unfortunately contracted the disease there. That would explain why only they have a slightly different accent. That's what I think. The isolation facility for Hansen's disease patients is actually the biggest secret that Eboshi Gosen keeps, even from Jikobo. This is the key point. In fact, it's not the other thing. The real secret development site is here. It was a new weapon that even Jikobo didn't know about. Jikobo thought that they were just mass-producing the Chinese-style matchlock guns imported from Ming China, and he was pushing them to produce these quickly, telling them to make them fast, burn the forest, and so on. He was telling them to defeat the boar god, but in reality, Eboshi Gozen was further improving the weapons and trying to mass produce their own arms. This ambition of Eboshi Gozen was something even Jikobo didn't know about. That's why, during the battle at the mountain pass, Eboshi boldly appears with the new type of matchlock gun. So the reason she showed them to Jikobo, even though they were a kind of secret weapon, was because it might have been her way of saying, we are capable of making things like this, so you should value us a bit more. Specifically, instead of dismantling or occupying the ironworks, it would be better for you to let us do as we please, and that would be more worthwhile for you. Or perhaps it was a sign that their cooperative relationship with Jikobo was about to end, a declaration of intent for battle. I thought it could have been a signal like that.
岡田敏夫の YouTube を見てくれてありがとうございます。ぜひぜひチャンネル登録よろしくお願いします。ではではよろしく。